Now it's my pleasure to introduce Lyman Baker. Lyman is an instructor in the English department here and a longtime admirer of tonight's speaker. Lyman.
I want to begin by just mentioning some ground rules that we'll have here. Professor Chomsky, of course, will take questions, but we do need to be a little careful of his energies, and so we'll try to limit that to 25 minutes, and that means that we would like to hear from as many people as possible, and if you would please keep your questions as pointed as you can, that would be kind to your neighbors. We have two microphones here, one on each side aisle, and the questions will be taken first from this side and then from that side. I believe there is a person from the International Coordinating Committee who is going to ask the first question. I'll ask that person to position himself or herself over on this microphone in time. It's my honor tonight to set a little context to what we're going to hear shortly. I want to do that by getting us to think a little about the notion of enlightenment. A little over 200 years ago, in 1784, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant looked back over the last couple of centuries before him and forward toward the dim future that is now us. He was living at the culmination of an era which had seen an immense progress in knowledge of the natural world. Just think for a minute of that hard-fought revolution in astronomy and physics that began with Copernicus and climaxed in Newton. It's an amazing achievement, and if we trace it out, which I'm not going to do here, we can get some inkling of the justified pride people after Newton felt in the power of human intellect to discover startling, non-obvious truths about the human situation as shaped by the laws of nature. In the political realm, too, as you know, the American Revolution had by 1784 made clear some people were beginning to think beyond what long tradition taught generations to accept as the laws that must govern human societies. Already then, people were speaking of this era as the Age of Enlightenment. So it's not surprising that in 1784, the editors of a newspaper turned to Immanuel Kant, the most famous philosopher of the day, to answer for its readers the question, what is enlightenment? I want to read you just the core of his classic statement. He began with a definition. Must have had freshman English. And it goes like this. You'll have to listen very closely. Enlightenment is a person's emergence from his self-sustained dependency. So we have to go define those terms. Dependency is the inability to make use of one's intellect without the supervision of another. It's like a child. You have to have a tutor. You have to be told what to think. One's dependency is self-sustained. Remember, it's a self-sustained dependency that enlightenment is the emergence from. One's dependency is self-sustained when its cause lies not in defective intellect. You're retarded, you've been brain damaged, you've gone senile or insane, a terrible misfortune. When its cause lies not in that, but in the lack of decisiveness and the courage to make use of one's own mind without the direction of another. Dare to know is thus the slogan of the Enlightenment. For Kant, enlightenment is something to be proud of because it takes a certain character to think for oneself. It's not a matter of knowledge for him, it's a matter of character. Its opposite, self-incurred dependency, is something pitiful because it's rooted in laziness and lack of nerve. Here's what he says about laziness. It is so comfortable to be dependent. If I have a book that understands for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who prescribes a diet for me, and so on, I don't need to bother myself. There's no need for me to think when I can just pay. Others will take over the whole irksome business for me. Well, that kind of sloth is degrading. So is cowardice. The vast majority, Kant observed, regard the step, this is his language, to independence, quite apart from its difficulty, as dangerous. But he goes on. It's not just their lack of character here. This is something quite deliberately arranged for by those guardians who have so kindly assumed the burden of supervising them. And you can see that Kant was not looking to sustain that aristocracy. He was looking to see it subverted. Our speaker tonight is going to show you some disturbing ways in which the people who have decided to act as our guardians have been working to keep us in a condition of what Kant called dependency. When the discussion tonight is over, you will have formed a picture of how our custodians have invested prodigious resources and effort in cultivating our ignorance and in fostering the laziness and the fear that persuades us that it's too hard and dangerous for us to insist on knowing what they're doing in the name of what they call our national interests. When we're done this evening, you will not know whether our speaker is right. But I hope that you will be convinced that the questions he raises are so important that you must find out the truth for yourself. If you take up this challenge, you're in for a seriously exciting life. If you leave this place tonight determined to take charge of your own education, to take responsibility for using your own intellect, for using it well, you will be joining the great tradition of the Enlightenment. You'll find on the back of the sheet you were given when you entered this auditorium, the yellow one here introducing Noam Chomsky, some possible starting points for pursuing that curiosity. Right now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the most powerful example that I know of the Enlightenment in our day and age. His own life is a very model of what it is for a human being to take charge of his own education and to bring back news of the universe vital for our survival. In a minute, you'll witness this independence of mind and this breadth of self-education for yourself. But I want to point out something about what you might want to notice in that little intellectual biography you received of Professor Chomsky when you entered this evening. Sometime tomorrow, not now, look it over again. See if you can see where he refused to stay pigeonholed in his specialty, where he was a recognized authority, where he could play it safe by leaving foreign policy to the experts in that specialty. See if you can spot where he must have felt insulted by being treated as out of his depth, felt offended by the idea that government was the business of a self-recruited caste of guardians and not to be meddled with by amateurs uncertified by them. Can you appreciate the courage it took to point out the ignorance and arrogance of the experts in the middle of a war, not to close ranks around the flag, but to rally fellow citizens to listen to facts and act on their conscience? And I mean unpleasant facts in the light of that very conscience. I'll mention two. Our government ran an assassination program, probably responsible for 40,000 deaths in the villages and hamlets of Vietnam. That's how we were fighting terrorism. I'll mention one more. We made the conscious decision, our guardians, that the Viet Cong could not be defeated so long as its constituency continued to exist, and they knew its constituency was the rural population of Vietnam, 98% of the population, and so they proceeded to eliminate it by direct application of mechanical and conventional power, Orwellian language, on such a scale as to effect a massive migration from rural to urban areas, where people were then housed in refugee camps. Elsewhere they'd be called concentration camps. That's how we saved Vietnam for democracy. We bombed out the way of life of 98% of the population. Pretty horrible. Pretty outlandish. You hadn't heard about it. I hadn't heard about it. We live in a free country. We have a free press. If something like that had happened, I'd have heard about it. I haven't heard about it, so it must not have happened. I can go back to sleep. Thanks. It's not that easy. Can you appreciate the immense passion of wanting to know that it took to smoke out the folks who were pursuing the interest not of the nation as a whole, but of the agenda of a narrow majority of powerful people? Can you appreciate the steel will it must have taken to keep pointing out, since the mid-70s, the role our government has had in encouraging the exterminations in Indonesia? Not just recent news. And turning a blind eye to the Holocaust in East Timor, which did not begin just this year. And when he found himself blocked in trying to bring these facts before the conscience of his fellow citizens, what did he do? He decided to find out why. He made He made himself learn what is going on in the corporate mass media, in the public relations networks of think tanks, academia, government, and the press. He made himself into an expert on the operations of the propaganda systems characteristic of non-totalitarian societies. I would say that's somebody who took charge of his education. Please welcome one of the greatest Americans ever, whom we have the privilege of crossing lives with tonight, Noam Chomsky.
The topic for tonight, sovereignty and world order, that was actually selected some time ago, over a year ago, I think, maybe more. But the choice was prescient, as it turned out. These have been the catchwords of 1999, sovereignty and world order, and in very instructive ways. The concern for sovereignty has gone through two phases. The first phase was in the first part of the year, when the focus was on the U.S. NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. And the second phase is in the last few weeks, in connection with the renewed atrocities in East Timor. And the comparison of those two phases is highly instructive for those who want to understand how world order actually works, and also how our own doctrinal system works. So let's have a look at it. During the first phase, I'm now mostly quoting from leading journals, Foreign Affairs and others. During the first phase, first half of the year, there was a phase of extreme exuberance. We were entering a new era, new in human history, in which the enlightened states will use force when they believe it to be just, disregarding old-fashioned concepts of sovereignty and international law. All of these are now consigned to the ash can of history, where they belong. No more restrictive old rules. The enlightened states will defend human rights. They'll act on their traditional principles and values. Their mission is the defense of human rights is their mission. Secretary of State Albright, that time, proclaimed with awe by the New York Times. The mission is defied by some parts of the world, namely the rogue states, like, for example, Cuba today, or Nicaragua before it was returned to the free world, or Iraq since 1990, when Saddam Hussein disobeyed orders and Iraq became a rogue state, but not before 1990, when he was a favored friend and ally and a recipient of massive aid while he was just gassing Kurds and torturing dissidents and, in fact, committing by far the worst crimes of his awful career, for which he was rewarded by an increasing flow of military and other aid by the enlightened states. Let me stress right away that these sour notes are irrelevant, declared to be irrelevant. In fact, examination of the factual record is impermissible. It's just sound bites and invectives about Washington's historically evil foreign policy, hence easy to ignore. Quoting one of the leading scholar advocates of the new humanism, who's sneering at the absurdity of taking facts taking facts into account in assessing the theological doctrines of the enlightened states, which is quite a wise stance when you look at what the facts tell us. Well, that's the first half of the year. We were deluged with ecstatic pronouncements from leading moralists and political figures and scholars and so on about this remarkable era that we're entering under the leadership of the enlightened states, no longer encumbered by these old-fashioned notions of sovereignty and international law. That's the first phase. Now let's go to the second phase. The second phase is the last few weeks. The tune changed, and changed very radically, as attention shifted to East Timor, where there was a renewal. Actually, since the beginning of the year, there's been a very sharp renewal, but it finally reached the point where it could no longer be ignored in the last few weeks. There was a renewal of the terror and violence and massacres that have been going on for 25 years. That's actually the worst slaughter relative to population since the Holocaust. Now it turns out that sovereignty has to receive delicate and exaggerated respect, even when there is no sovereignty, because of course Indonesia has no claim to sovereignty in East Timor, apart from the claim that resides in the support given to its aggression by the great powers, in particular the enlightened states, in particular the leader of the enlightened states. So here we have to have very great concern for sovereignty. Turns out that human rights don't matter. We have to put aside our mission. We have to ask for the invitation of the invaders before any move can be made, like withholding military aid and so on, because that would be intervention in a sovereign state, and we can't think of doing that. So suddenly the picture is exactly the opposite. From total disdain and contempt for sovereignty, in the case of Serbia, which by accident happens to be the only corner of Europe that's resisting U.S. plans for the region, their sovereignty doesn't matter at all. But when we turn to a client state, one of the major mass murderers of the modern period, then concern for sovereignty is so exalted that we have to delicately observe it, even when there's no sovereignty at all. Well, it's an interesting transition, and it does raise some questions. What happened? What's the difference? One difference that might come to mind is the one I just mentioned. In one case, the state whose sovereignty doesn't matter happens to be an enemy state. In the other, it happens to be a client state. Suggests a hypothesis, but let's put it aside and ask some other questions. The first question is, I mentioned that the first half of the year was a period of enormous exuberance about the remarkable new age and, great era, enlightened states, et cetera, et cetera. What was the attitude outside the enlightened states? And certainly, who are the enlightened states? And how do you gain the rank of enlightened states? What are the criteria for membership in the club? Well, criteria for the membership in the club turn out to be very easy. It's done by definition. You become an enlightened state not by virtue of your record. In fact, the record is declared irrelevant, and if anyone were to look at the record, it would hardly provide the right qualifications, but it's just true by definition. The United States is an enlightened state by definition. It's a attack dog. Great Britain is an enlightened state as long as it follows orders. And anyone else who enlists in a crusade is an enlightened state. Everyone else is a rogue state. So it's very easy to make the distinction. What is the attitude of outside the enlightened states toward the remarkable new era? Well, you really don't find very much about that in discussion here, but if you make an effort, you can discover it. What you find is that outside of the self-defined enlightened states, there was shock and dismay over the contempt shown for sovereignty in international law. So if you go to, that's true even of some U.S. client states like Israel and Egypt, but if you go beyond to, say, India or Thailand or Latin America, the reaction was pretty uniform. Fear. Most of the world, well, their attitude was pretty well expressed by the Archbishop of São Paulo, who asked who are they going to attack next and on what pretext. There was a considerable talk throughout much of the world about the need to develop deterrence. nuclear weapons or some other deterrent to defend oneself from the enlightened states, who now apparently feel free to do anything, to rampage at will, having no deterrent at all. In fact, if you look across the world, a fairly general, I think an accurate description would be that the more that a state had the capability to use violence at will, the greater was its contempt for sovereignty, that is, the sovereignty of others. The United States overwhelmingly had far more capability to use violence than any other competitor, and here the exuberance was overwhelming, and it declines until you get to the traditional victims. In fact, the break was very close to what's nowadays called the North-South division. That's a euphemism for the distinction between the old imperial countries and their old colonies. In the former colonies, there was shock, fear, and dismay. In the imperial states, particularly the more powerful of them, enormous exuberance over the end of any barriers to use of violence, such as these kind of musty old notions of international law and sovereignty. That's a pretty general conclusion. I think you'll find an accurate one if you look at commentary around the world, here and elsewhere. And again, it suggests some hypotheses about what's going on. This nevertheless requires some further qualifications, because the attitude towards sovereignty in the leader of the enlightened states, the United States, self-defined leader of the United States, of the enlightened states, its attitude towards sovereignty was more nuanced than what I just suggested. It's true that for the others, sovereignty can be dismissed with contempt. In other words, we can use force at will as we believe it to be just, because we define ourselves to be enlightened. On the other hand, our own sovereignty and that of our client states, that has to be guarded as a precious treasure. In our own case, the point is obvious, in fact, pretty hard to ignore. Just not long ago, for example, the United States refused to accept an international criminal court that would prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the reason was pretty straightforward. The reason was that if we accepted the existence of such a court, we would be surrendering our sovereignty. And obviously we can't do that because our sovereignty is sacrosanct. That was brazen enough to receive some comment, but what is less noticed is that that's pretty uniform. The United States has a terrible record, one of the worst in the world, in signing, in ratifying international human rights conventions to implement the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, for example, in the case of the Convention on Rights of the Child, it's been ratified by every country in the world except two, the United States and Somalia. Somalia didn't ratify it because it doesn't have a government. And that's fairly general. In fact, it's even worse than that. In a strict sense, the United States has ratified no covenants. The reason is that everyone that is ratified, and there aren't very many, has a reservation which says inapplicable to the United States. It's called non-self-executing, technically. So some conventions are ratified, not too many, but inapplicable here. There was an interesting example of that early this year during the period of euphoria about the new Enlightenment. Again, didn't receive huge headlines, but if you were looking carefully, you noticed that there was a case brought to the World Court charging the United States and the other NATO powers with war crimes. And the World Court refused to accept the case, turned down the case on technical grounds, not because the charges were wrong, but on technical grounds. The technical grounds were that, and if you look at them, they're interesting, the United States presented an airtight legal argument to show that the case could not be brought, and the court correctly accepted this argument. What was the argument? Well, the case was brought under the Genocide Convention. The United States had World Court rules, I should say, require that all parties to a dispute accept jurisdiction. Otherwise, the court can't adjudicate. And the U.S. argument was that the United States doesn't accept jurisdiction because even though it did sign the Genocide Convention after a delay of, I think, about 40 years, it signed it with a reservation saying inapplicable to the United States. So therefore, the United States can't be brought before the court on these charges, so it doesn't matter what their merit is. And that's a correct argument, so the court dismissed it. As I say, that's typical. Sovereignty has to be very carefully protected, like a precious jewel when it's our own sovereignty. It's only the sovereignty of various enemies that doesn't matter, that means nothing. And that extends much more broadly. So why don't, as you know, I'm sure, the United States is practically destroying the United Nations by refusing to pay its legally obligated debts. The debts are required by treaty, but the United States doesn't pay them because that would be a sacrifice of sovereignty. Why should we allow some organization that we don't control to function if at the expense of our own freedom to act? So the U.S. just doesn't pay its debts or adhere to treaties generally. In fact, by the 1990s, U.S. violation of international treaties has become so extreme that the Professional Society of International Law, American Society for International Law, in a couple issues back, its editor had an article called Taking Treaties Seriously, condemning the U.S. refusal, increasingly brazen U.S. refusal, to adhere to treaty obligations, the grounds always being the same. They're an interference with U.S. sovereignty, which has to be sustained. The same is true of the World Trade Organization, particularly interesting case because it's a U.S. creation, but it does have rules, and the U.S. blatantly violates the rules when it chooses to, and is called to account. So, for example, the European Union recently brought charges to the World Trade Organization that the U.S. was violating its rules by its quite murderous, incidentally, its murderous embargo of Cuba, which violates the World Trade Organization rules because it involves secondary restrictions against other countries, extraterritorial restrictions. And of course, it's grossly in violation of international humanitarian law with its provisions barring food and even effectively medicine. Well, the U.S. responded to that by declaring a national security exemption. The survival of the United States depends on making sure that Cuban children starve or die in hospitals from lack of medicine. So therefore, we can't accept the authority of the World Trade Organization, our creation, in the case of the embargo on Cuba. The idea that this is a national security issue is perhaps too idiotic to discuss, but it illustrates again the extreme dedication to our own sovereignty, our right to do anything we want, right in the midst of the period when we're hailing the new era in which sovereignty doesn't matter anymore, because the enlightened states will lead the world to, on their mission of preserving human rights. For years, the attack against Cuba had been justified on Cold War pretexts. Cuba is a tentacle of the evil empire threatening to strangle us. That was always complete nonsense. The formal decision to overthrow the government of Cuba was made secretly in March 1960, when there was no connection between Cuba and the Soviet Union. After the Cold War ended, the attack against Cuba got harsher. These facts alone undermine totally the Cold War arguments, but it's more interesting when you look at the real arguments, which have now been declassified, so you can look at them. When the Kennedy administration came in, among its first acts was to extend the attack against Cuba, and it had a Latin American mission. President Kennedy had a Latin American mission which surveyed the situation in the hemisphere, its report was transmitted to the president by historian Arthur Schlesinger, and of course he discussed Cuba, the conclusions about Cuba, and he described the threat that Cuba posed to the United States. The threat was, I'm now quoting it, the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands, a serious problem in a region like Latin America where wealth is very highly concentrated, quoting again, and the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution, are demanding opportunities for a decent living. Well, that's a threat, so we obviously have to defend ourselves against it and carry out terror and embargo and invasions and so on to block the threat. And certainly there was a Cold War element. Schlesinger adds that Russia is hovering in the background, offering development loans and presenting itself as a model for industrialization in a single generation. So that's a real Cold War issue. Incidentally, if you think this through, you get a good understanding of what the Cold War was about since 1917. Those models and efforts at independence cannot be tolerated because they undermine a world system which has to be organized on different grounds. It has to be organized in the interests of the privileged and the wealthy and the powerful, the ones whose sovereignty has to be protected and respected, while everyone else's can be dismissed and ignored. I should add that the contempt for sovereignty is nothing new in the early part of this year. It just reached, it just became expressed with extraordinary exuberance as part of the justification for bombing a European country, but it's standard. Contempt for sovereignty is as old as American history. Those of you who remember your American history will know that it begins in the 1770s and goes on without a break until today. So the sovereignty of others is of no account if they're in our way, if they're what are called rogue states, meaning not following orders, but our own sovereignty and that of our client states and those that join with us, that has to be protected. None of this is new, but also none of it matters. It's all, remember, declared irrelevant. It's just facts. This contempt for others and for international law and insistence on respecting respecting the sovereignty of clients and, of course, our own sovereignty, this is often expressed in very crude and crass ways, which publicly, which you should attend to. They're important. So, for example, when Dean Acheson, who was a highly respected statesman and one of the creators of the post-war world and a senior advisor to the Kennedy administration, in 1962, at the time when the plainly illegal embargo of Cuba was instituted, Acheson gave a defense of it, public defense, before the American Society of International Law. And in that defense, he pointed out that that the power, prestige, and position of the United States is not a legal issue. So no questions of international law arise when the prestige, position, or power of the United States is at stake, because we're above all that. Okay? He said international law has its uses. Its uses, he said, are to gild our positions with pleasant verbiage when we can do so. But other than that, if our own prestige, power, or influence is at stake, international law is irrelevant. Well, it's an accurate statement. The United States didn't invent that position, of course. Every country in the world, including Andorra, would take the same position if they could get away with it. But the United States happens to be able to get away with it. That's what it means to be the biggest thug on the block. You can get away with such things. And you can also get away with self-adulation for your magnificence and being an enlightened state, carrying out all sorts of wonderful missions. An even more dramatic example, and one that would be taught in every school in a society that valued its freedom, was the reaction of the United States, public reaction, when a case was brought against the United States at the World Court by Nicaragua in 1985. That reaction was interesting. The United States, as I'm sure you should know, or I hope you know, refused jurisdiction. The World Court nevertheless condemned the United States for what it called the unlawful use of force, in other words, war crimes, against Nicaragua, ordered the United States to desist and to pay substantial reparations. Of course, that was dismissed with the usual contempt. The war was immediately escalated, and reparations we don't bother talking about. But what's interesting in this connection is the reasons. The State Department legal advisor gave the official reasons why the U.S. will not accept the World Court judgment. The reason is, I'm now quoting, that members of the United Nations cannot be counted on to share our views and often oppose the United States on important international questions. Hence, we must reserve to ourselves the right to decide when court rulings apply and will not accept compulsory jurisdiction by the court over any dispute involving matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States as determined by the United States. In this case, the issue within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States was Washington's war against Nicaragua, what the court condemned as the unlawful use of force. Well, as I say, that should be taught in schools. Everybody should know that by heart. And if in a society which valued its freedom, it would be known. Also known would be the declarations of Secretary of State George Shultz, who was regarded as Mr. Clean of the Reagan administration, explaining this. What he said is the following. He said, negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table. And he condemned those who advocate utopian legalistic means like outside mediation, the United Nations, and the World Court, while ignoring the power element of the equation. Those remarks are not without precedent in modern history. You can think of a few examples. The delivery was carefully timed. They were delivered at the moment of the U.S. bombing of Libya, of Libyan cities, Tripoli and Benghazi, killing many civilians. Incidentally, the first bombing in history, which was planned and executed for primetime television. It was very carefully timed so that it would begin right at the 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which at that time was when the three television channels had their major news programs, and by sheer accident they all happened to have their crews in Libya, where of course they are all the time, so that they could film the exciting events as they happened and then give the administration the first hour of control over television news to give its proper spin. You're somehow not supposed to notice this, just kind of happened. Well, all of these again are things that are worth knowing, teaching, should be known by heart, in fact, and they tell us a lot about the U.S. attitude towards sovereignty, its own sovereignty. Sovereignty of others is treated with the same contempt that it has been since the 1770s. So to take an example which is almost trivial by comparison with the full record, it's just a year now since the United States, the Clinton administration, decided to destroy half the pharmaceutical supplies of a poor African country, killing nobody knows how many thousands or tens of thousands of people. That's kind of, you don't even notice it. I mean, nobody mentions it. It's conceded that it was just a kind of a random act of violence, but that's all right, because what does their sovereignty matter? It's our sovereignty that matters. That's during the period of enlightenment, the first phase. I haven't gotten to the second phase yet. Well, it's not only let's go to the second phase. Here we see that it's not only the United States that has this august position in which sovereignty has to be treasured, but also client states. So Indonesia, for example. Indonesia has one of the most brutal and murderous records of the modern period, but as they renewed the atrocities in East Timor this year, their sovereignty had to be very delicately respected, even though it does not exist. Remember, this is their sovereignty in East Timor is comparable to that of Saddam Hussein's in Kuwait or of Nazi Germany's in occupied France. Exactly that amount of sovereignty exists, but it has to be respected, treasured, in fact. The official U.S. position has been that it is their responsibility, Indonesia's responsibility, to keep order in East Timor, the country that they have conquered and where they have massacred maybe a third of the population. It's their responsibility. We don't want to take it away from them. I'll come back to the details of this, but that remained the U.S. position right through the period in the last few weeks when it became impossible to ignore the level of the atrocities, and when the Clinton administration, in fact, was finally compelled to make some pretty minor moves, compelled by domestic pressure and particularly by Australian pressure, international pressure, who they were making a huge issue of it. And Clinton did finally, about a week ago, 10 days ago, have to make a few indications to the Indonesian generals that this wasn't nice, and that sufficed for them to reverse course totally, which indicates the latent power that has been available throughout. Incidentally, this continues while we're talking. There are hundreds of thousands of people who were driven up into the hills in East Timor, where they're apparently starving to death as far as anyone knows. There happens to be a country that could easily carry out airdrops of food. We know which one it is. Has the logistic and technical capacities to drop food to people starving to death in the mountains where they've been driven by forces armed and trained by the United States and supported by the United States. You don't notice it happening. In fact, you don't even notice anybody talking about it because it's out of the question. Remember, our mission is to defend human rights, but not when human rights are being trampled on in a horrendous fashion by a client state that we've been supporting in its atrocities and massacres for 25 years here alone and also in other places. So there's no talk about the Air Force dropping food to starving refugees. The Air Force is quite capable of destroying civilian targets in a country whose sovereignty doesn't matter. There we pinpoint bombing, destroy civilian targets, and so on. That's fine. But it's not capable of dropping food to starving people. That's not ancient history like last week. That's today. Sovereignty is granted by the United States, denied by the United States. These are among the prerogatives of power, and the flatterers at the court have to explain to us why this is all noble and elevated. There's a lot more to say about this. If you'd like to bring it up, I'll give some other examples. There's some rather remarkable cases in the Middle East right now. But let me just, the new era was, without going into further details, the new era was well defined by a figure who is highly respected in the United States when he says the right things, that happen to be ignored this time, namely Alexander Solzhenitsyn, during the first part of this year, when he described the new era that the United States was announcing as a new era based on the principle that might is right. And that's correct, and that is in fact the position that was echoed throughout a good part of the world, probably a large majority of it, outside the self-defined realms of enlightenment. Well, what's the attitude of the United States and other self-defined enlightened states towards human rights? Same answer. Might is right. Examples are legion. I'll just keep to 1999. Let's take East Timor. Just quick give you a brief review of some of those sound bites and invectives that you're not supposed to know about according to the guardians of doctrinal purity, and which aren't too well known, unfortunately, but they should be. In December 1975, Indonesia, U.S.-supported state, client state, invaded the territory of East Timor, to which I had no claim whatsoever. The invasion was carried out with U.S. arms, which by treaty with Indonesia can be used only for self-defense. The U.S. secretly expressed the hope that the invasion would be carried out quickly without too much attention to the fact that U.S. arms were illegally being used. The U.S. did declare an arms embargo because there was a lot of protest, but violated it at once by sending new arms under the cover of the embargo, including vitally needed counterinsurgency equipment. The Security Council of the United Nations acted. It condemned the invasion unanimously and ordered Indonesia to withdraw at once. But that had no effect, and the reason why it had no effect was explained by the U.S. ambassador, again in words that would be memorized by anyone who valued the freedom that they enjoyed and who has an interest in world affairs, international law, and human rights. This is not some right-wing reactionary. This is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a liberal senator from New York, who was then UN ambassador. He wrote his memoirs a few years later, 1978, and in the memoirs he explains why the Security Council was ineffective. What he says is that the United States wanted things to turn out as they did. The State Department wanted the United Nations to be utterly ineffective in anything that it might do. I was given the task of carrying this out, and I carried it out with considerable success. That's frank and open. He also was aware of the success. He goes on to say that in the next few months, about 60,000 people were reported killed, about the same percentage of the population as the numbers that Hitler killed in Eastern Europe during the Second World War. His comment, not mine. And then he says, well, after that, the matter disappeared from the press so that the whole thing was successful. It did indeed disappear from the press and was literally and was quite successful, but the fighting didn't stop. Only the reporting stopped. And it's also out of history. Try to find some mention of it in the discussion, which has been pretty intense in the last couple of weeks. What happened after that is that the Carter administration took over, the Human Rights Administration, and provided a new flow of arms to Indonesia, which it immediately used to carry out the attack to near genocidal levels. The people had been driven to the mountains, the Indonesian army using new arms, jet planes, napalm, and so on, supplied by the Human Rights Administration, carried out a massive attack to drive the population down to the protection of the Indonesians, as the State Department put it. It's at that point that the church and other sources in East Timor tried to get the world to recognize what was going on. It's from that point, it's at that time that the figure of 200,000 killed, which is now widely accepted, was presented by the church as a plausible estimate. At that time was denied, now it's conceded. And so it continues right up till the present. There was a moment of hope early this year. In January, Indonesia, the Indonesian president, interim president, proposed a referendum in which the people of East Timor could decide between independence and autonomy. The Indonesian army, which runs it, reacted at once by stepping up atrocities. They sent new units of their elite special forces units, Kopassus units, which are trained by and armed by the United States and are famed for their atrocities in East Timor and elsewhere. They were sent to East Timor. They organized what are called militias, paramilitary forces, consisting to a large extent of Indonesians, which immediately started carrying out large-scale terror. Very little reporting of it here, but it was going on, it was building up, everybody knew it was coming. The United States temporized, wouldn't do anything, refused to react. This In fact, I should say that throughout this whole period, arms and training for the Indonesians continued. Just in 1997-98, in that single year, government licensed commercial arms sales to Indonesia increased by a factor of 5. Training exercises, the Pentagon has just announced about a week ago, the training exercises continued up until August 25th, 5 days before the referendum. This was called training in humanitarian training and disaster relief. Orwell couldn't have said it better. What happened next, the referendum took place, despite the right in the middle of this, so like in April, when atrocities were really peaking. The United States did send a military mission. The head of the Pacific Command, Admiral Blair, was sent to talk to General Wiranto, the Indonesian Chief of Staff, in theory, to tell him to call off the massacres. Turned out what he actually told him was that the U.S. would continue to provide assistance and support. This was revealed recently by Alan Nairn, an independent journalist who's done a fantastic job there and elsewhere, and in fact has been in an Indonesian jail for the last couple of days without any report here. Was finally released, probably under mostly congressional pressure. Admiral Blair went to give this message just shortly after one of the really ugly massacres, a killing of about 60 people in a church in which they'd taken refuge, brutal murder, just one of many. Well, what happened? The population, in a remarkable display of heroism, went to the polls. Despite large-scale terror, intimidation, killings, tens of thousands of people driven into the hills to hide. Nevertheless, about almost 99% of the population braved it and went to the polls and voted overwhelmingly for independence. The reaction to that was steps to virtually wipe the country out. In the next couple of weeks, we're now in early September, massacres, nobody knows how many people were killed. Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe half the population or more was expelled from their homes, just huge atrocities. Finally, as I mentioned, the United States was compelled to take a stand, to register objection, at which point the Indonesians called it off, meaning they could have done it all along. Well, to its credit, the New York Times ran an op-ed about this. Give credit where credit is due. On September 15th, an Indonesia historian, John Rusa, who was an observer at the elections, wrote a good op-ed in which he pointed out the truth. He said, given that this last pogrom was so predictable, it was easily preventable, but Clinton dithered and refused even to discuss sending peacekeeping forces. That's true. That's exactly what was going on all this year as the Australians got more and more furious at U.S. refusal even to consider a peacekeeping force. Those who have some historical memory would know that this is a replay, an ugly replay of almost exactly what happened 20 years ago. 20 years ago, after this huge massacre in which hundreds of thousands were killed, finally Indonesia agreed to allow members of the Jakarta Diplomatic Corps to make a brief visit to East Timor to see what they felt secure enough to allow some in. One of them was Carter's ambassador, Ambassador Masters. Ambassador Masters witnessed a disaster which those who were with him compared with Biafra and Cambodia. What came next was described in testimony at the United Nations by one of the leading Indonesia historians in the world, Benedict Anderson, American historian of Indonesia. He testified that Ambassador Masters delayed for 9 long months, refusing to request humanitarian aid even internally in the State Department until the Indonesian generals gave him the green light, saying that they felt secure enough to allow the Red Cross in and to allow humanitarian aid in. In other words, just what happened again in the last couple of weeks. same story, repeated. Well, all of this, unfortunately, happens to be rather typical of the attitude towards human rights, as do the reasons. The reason why the reasons were actually stated pretty frankly in the last couple of weeks, several times, including by a senior Western diplomat in Jakarta in Indonesia, who said it very simply. He said, Indonesia matters, East Timor doesn't. It was explained in more detail in a front page story by two Asia specialists of the New York Times, who pointed out accurately that the Clinton administration had to make a calculation in which they compared on the one side the importance to us of a resource-rich country of a couple 100 million people, from which we make enormous profits, and on the other side a poor, impoverished country of 800,000 people. You make that calculation, it's pretty obvious how to react. It was put more graphically by high American officials who early in the year said, in East Timor, we don't have any dog in that race. In other words, it doesn't matter what happens there. Just a few weeks ago, they changed their tune. They said, yeah, we do have a dog in the race, a big dog, namely Australia. Australia's making a fuss, and they matter, so now we have a dog in the race, so we have to change. What about the population of the country who have been tortured and massacred with our aid for 25 years? Well, they're not even a small dog. Well, that's the way human rights really work. Let me just go back to the first phase and ask what was the first phase of the year. Let's ask what was happening then. In April, last April, right in the midst of this euphoria about the grand new era and so on, there was an anniversary, the 50th anniversary of NATO in Washington, widely reported. It wasn't a joyful anniversary because the meeting was under the somber cloud of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, and therefore, a lot of gloom and concern about ethnic cleansing. It took a good deal. You have to admire the commentators, journalists and others, who were able somehow to overlook the fact that some of the worst ethnic cleansing of the 1990s was within NATO, not across its borders, but within NATO, namely in its southeastern corner, in Turkey, NATO member, under the jurisdiction of the Council of Europe and the European Court of Justice, which regularly hands down condemnations for ethnic cleansing and other atrocities, 8 of them last year. And that was no small affair, way beyond Kosovo. 2 to 3 million refugees, about 3,500 villages destroyed, 7 times Kosovo, tens of thousands of people killed, Kurds, all far beyond Kosovo, even after the bombing, let alone before the bombing. How did it happen? Well, it happened thanks to the Clinton administration. As the atrocities peaked, the Turkish government uses approximately 80% U.S. arms. As atrocities mounted through the 1990s, after the Turkish government rejected in 1992 peace negotiations offers from the Kurdish rebels, atrocities picked up. That's when those numbers I just mentioned came. And the Clinton administration sent an increasing flow of arms. In fact, Turkey became the leading military importer in the world. And this is advanced armaments, like jet planes and napalms and so on. And you look through the records, any imaginable kind of atrocity was carried out. All of this right within NATO, right in the 1990s, actually continuing now, ignored at the NATO anniversary meeting, and in fact, throughout. Take a look do a database search on the press. If you don't want to bother, don't do it. I've done it, and I'll tell you what you'll find. Essentially nothing. Because this is a huge atrocity, huge ethnic cleansing, terror, torture, everything you can think of, but carried out by the enlightened states, in fact, by the leader of the enlightened states within NATO. Therefore, it doesn't merit comment. Right at the moment when we are supposed to be overwhelmed with compassion for the victims of ethnic cleansing in an enemy state, namely in Kosovo. Let's finally take a look at that one. Now we're back to the peak example, the one we're supposed to look at, the atrocities in Kosovo. Well, there's a kind of a mantra that's repeated over and over, which says that in the case of Kosovo, for once we did the right thing. Yeah, I've done all sorts of bad things here and there, but there we did the right thing. We acted on our principles and values. We acted completely altruistically. Total break with history. The United States acted completely altruistically to defend human rights, and that's why we had this wonderful euphoria about the new era. Well, it's not a truth of logic. I mean, it's a question of fact, so therefore facts ought to be relevant, so let's have a look at them. Well, there's a standard version of this. It was repeated last week by the main foreign affairs specialist of the New York Times. Kind of unfair to quote him because everybody says the same thing, but let me quote that since the most recent last Sunday. Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who's incidentally calling for intervention in East Timor, says that the U.S. intervention in Kosovo made a crucial difference. It halted ethnic cleansing, and therefore it was legitimate. There's only one problem with that statement, which is repeated over and over again. The facts are the exact opposite, uncontroversially. The ethnic cleansing, the massive ethnic cleansing, was a consequence of the bombing, not the cause of it. There is no dispute about this. Simply take a look at the record of registered refugees across the border. Kosovo wasn't a pleasant place the year before, by any means. Unfortunately comparable to many other places in the world. But the massive ethnic cleansing came after the bombing. The bombing started on March 24th. At that time, the UN High Commission on Refugees, which takes care of refugees, had no registered refugees. The first ones were about 3 days later. On April 1st, a week after the bombing, it started giving its first daily reports on expulsions. And then it went up to the numbers, about 600,000-700,000. It's after the bombing. Furthermore, it was predictable. In fact, according to the U.S. commander, NATO commander, U.S. General Wesley Clark, it was entirely predictable. That was his words as the bombing started. What he said, it is entirely predictable that the bombing is going to cause a radical escalation in atrocities for pretty obvious reasons. When you bomb people, they don't throw flowers at you. They respond. And they don't respond where you're strong. They respond where they're strong. So they don't send jet planes to bomb New York. They respond on the ground where they're strong, escalating the atrocities. Furthermore, General Clark went on to say that the NATO operation, I'm quoting him, was not designed as a means of blocking Serb ethnic cleansing. Well, that's true. It couldn't have been, because the ethnic cleansing was the worst ethnic cleansing by far, was stimulated by the bombing. It was a consequence, not a cause. Furthermore, although the bombing was predicted and the atrocities were predicted and predictable, there was no preparation for them. In fact, it's worse than that. Shortly before, the United States had proceeded to defund the UN, the High Commission on Refugees, which is responsible for taking care of refugees. They had to cut their staff sharply in January because of U.S. refusal to pay dues. So not only did the United States and Britain refuse to make any preparations, they proceeded to defund the organizations which would have to take care of the refugees that were going to be generated, predictably, according to the commander, by the bombing they were carrying out. Well, put all that together and it increases the criminality of Clinton and Blair by quite a substantial measure. That only scratches the surface. There's no time to go into further details. But I really urge you to take a closer look. I've reviewed a lot of this in print if you're interested. But you can find the facts easily enough. They're not obscure. And what they reveal is that even in the single chosen case, it is totally impossible to believe a single word of the exalted rhetoric, let alone all the other cases that aren't discussed, like the ones I've been talking about. In fact, if you look a little bit further in history, you find that all of this is completely familiar. It's a kind of a tragic or worse, maybe obscene replay of what was going on a century ago. just a century ago, there was the same talk about how the enlightened states must bring civilization to the backward people of the world and must disregard sovereignty or anything else because they have their mission of bringing civilization, Christianity, and human rights. It was the concert of Europe and the United States and the Philippines and so on. Well, we know exactly what the consequences of that were. We don't have to wait to see. We have a century of history to show how that enlightenment was brought to the world. Is there any rational reason for expecting this phase of it to be any different? Most of the world doesn't think so. Outside the self-defined enlightened states, there's plenty of fear and concern over the revival of some of the worst days of European imperialism and the arrogance and self-adulation that went along with it. Well, this goes way back in history, and there's other principles, if you like, that also are deeply rooted and that we ought to maybe near universals. I'll just end with those. They're pretty obvious. I don't think there's anything profound. For people like us, that is, relatively privileged people in quite free societies, all of this is under control. None of it's inevitable. Terrible crimes are committed if we allow them to be committed. It's as simple as that. We're not talking about things happening on Mars or crimes being committed by Attila the Hun, but crimes being carried out by forces that are in principle under our control if we want to control them. We're not confronting laws of nature. These are questions of will and choice. You can't undo the past, but at the very least, you can look at it honestly. You can choose to look at it honestly, to learn lessons from it, and to use those lessons to affect the future.
We'll let people leave as they will here, and then when things calm down a little bit, we'll proceed to questions. So if you have a question, please find your way to one of the microphones in the aisles at the side. What I'll do is I'll
Where are the mics?
One is right here. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's just alternate, okay? So start over there.
Thank you for taking my question. As a preceding example, I'll just say that in light of the recent discussion about the Board of Education decision here, one of the deans here at the college said something to the effect of the board made a mistake by giving local districts flexibility to decide their curriculums, saying that we can't be leaving statewide standards up to local districts. In light of this kind of expanding the focus, I would appreciate if you comment on the ramifications of the sentiments behind this statement in the context of a government defending its sovereignty over and right to impose its will on its own people, kind of defining its own people as an enemy state, to use your own terminology.
Yeah, I'm not sure I caught that exactly. There was a statement, let me see if I got it. There was a statement saying that you can't leave educational decisions to the local
Yeah, yes, yes.
They have to be imposed from above by state regulation or something.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I hate to comment on something that I don't know anything about, and I know nothing about the situation, so it doesn't make any sense to ask me. I mean, in general, it sounds like a totally improper point of view, but not knowing anything about the details, I really can't comment.
You said in your talk, really, that governments, the enlightened states, act in their own self-interests as they perceive them, and that's not news, just like all the other states do. And you said that when they do so, they engage in hypocrisy, and they do so inconsistently, and that's not news either. But I kept waiting for the second part of your talk, where you would tell us how to respect national sovereignty and still deal with guys like Milosevic and Saddam Hussein and General Wiranto and Assad and people like that.
And Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and most of the others. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a problem. Incidentally, I'm sorry, did I interrupt? Okay, I didn't mean to
Let me just make a few more
Yeah.
points.
Yeah.
It seems to me that, in a sense, you're setting up a straw man because, I must admit that I had the same feelings you do about whether the United States has the right to go into Panama and decide what kind of government they should have, or to go into Guatemala, or to go into Nicaragua. But it is a real problem, and I think that it's not really served by setting up a straw man. I mean, it seems to me that you, in a sense, you're setting up a straw man when you say the enlightened states.
They call them.
Don't distinguish.
That's not my phrase. They're calling themselves the enlightened states.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a quote. Right?
But
I don't think they're enlightened states.
But the United States of Nixon is not the same as the United States of Carter, is not the same as the United States of Bush.
Really? I mean, was it which was the United States that was sending arms to Indonesia when they killed 200,000 people in East Timor? That was Carter. We're not allowed to say that, What we're allowed to say, like, for example, Anthony Lewis, the New York Times, at the outside limits of dissent, is allowed to say that Kissinger did some bad things. Let's wait for someone to say what Moynihan and Carter and Richard Holbrooke, our current ambassador at the United Nations, what they were doing. In fact, they were presiding over the worst period of the atrocities.
And what did the United States have to gain by intervening in Somalia?
In Somalia, we know exactly what they had to gain because they told us. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Clayton Powell, described this as the best public relations operation for the Pentagon that he could imagine. They needed his picture, which I think is plausible, is there was problems about raising the Pentagon budget, and they needed something that would be, look like a kind of a cakewalk, which would give a lot of prestige to the Pentagon. Somalia looked easy. Let's look back at the background. For years, the United States had supported a really brutal dictator who had just devastated the country. He was finally kicked out. After he was kicked out, and it was 1990, the country sank into total chaos and disaster with starvation and warfare and all kind of horrible misery. The United States refused certainly to pay reparations, but even to look. By 1992, by the middle of 1992, it was beginning to ease. The fighting was dying down. Food supplies were beginning to get in. The Red Cross was getting in roughly 80% of their supplies, they said. There was a harvest on the way. It looked like it was finally sort of settling down. At that point, all of a sudden, George Bush announced that he had been watching these heartbreaking pictures on television on Thanksgiving, and we had to do something. We had to send in humanitarian aid. The Marines landed in a landing which was so comical that even the media couldn't keep a straight face. Take a look at the reports of the landing of the Marines. It must have been the first week of December 1992. They had planned a night, there was nothing that had gone on, but they planned a night landing so they could show off all this fancy new night vision equipment and so on. But of course they had called in the television stations, because what's the point of, PR operation for the Pentagon if there's nobody to look for it. So the television stations were all there with their bright lights and that sort of thing. And as the Marines were coming ashore, they were blinded by the television lights. So they had to send people out to get the cameras, the cameramen to turn off the lights so they could land in the fancy new equipment. As I say, even the media could not keep a straight face on this one. And they reported it pretty accurately. Also reported the PR aspect. Well, the idea was, you could get some nice shots of Marine colonels handing out peanut butter sandwiches to starving refugees, and that would all look great. And so it looked for a couple of weeks until things started to get unpleasant. As things started to get unpleasant, the United States responded with what's called the Powell Doctrine. The United States has an unusual military doctrine. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. is generally disqualified from peacekeeping operations that involve civilians. Again, this has to do with sovereignty. U.S. military doctrine is that U.S. soldiers are not permitted to come under any threat. That's not true for other countries. So countries like, say, Canada or, the Fiji Islands or Pakistan or Norway, their soldiers are coming under threat all the time. The peacekeepers in southern Lebanon, for example, are being attacked by Israeli soldiers all the time and have suffered plenty of casualties, and they don't like it. But U.S. soldiers are not permitted to come under any threat. So when Somali teenagers started shaking fists at them and more, they came back with massive firepower, and that led to a massacre. According to the U.S., I don't know the actual numbers, but according to the U.S. government, about 7,000 to 10,000 Somali civilians were killed before this was over. There's a close analysis of all of this by Alex de Waal, who's one of the world's leading specialists on African famines and relief altogether, academic specialist. His estimate is the number of people saved by the intervention and the number killed by the intervention was approximately in the same ballpark. That's Somalia. That's what's given as a stellar example of a humanitarian intervention. The other example that's given, if you want, I'll go through it, is Haiti, which tells the same story. It was an atrocity. In fact, if you can, I've been curious. Here's an exercise for you. I've tried it myself. You can try. See if you can find all through history, human history, an example of a humanitarian intervention. That is an intervention that was undertaken by some state with humanitarian intent. Okay? Now, if you look at the big, thick case books of international law, international humanitarian law, you find some examples. They point out that it's really hard to find an example, but they give a few, Well, you take a look. I won't, if you want, I'll go through them. I've done it. If you go through those examples, they collapse on inspection. It's extremely hard to find them. This may be the null set. It's not clear that there ever has been a humanitarian intervention. That is, one with humanitarian intent. There are interventions that have had humanitarian consequences, which is something quite different. In recent years, there have been several, and it's instructive to look at them. There are two that are the most dramatic cases. One of them was the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in December 1978, which kicked out Pol Pot and did terminate huge massacres just as they were peaking. The worst massacres, piles of skulls you see all the time. They were in late 1978, and that's when the Vietnamese invaded. They threw out Pol Pot. That ended those atrocities. How did the United States respond to that? Well, bitterly condemned what were called the Prussians of Asia, and they were punished for their crime of terminating Pol Pot's atrocities. First, they were punished by a Chinese invasion, which the U.S. supported. Then they were punished by an extremely harsh embargo. It's not bad enough what we did to Vietnam, but they had to be punished again because of the crime of throwing out Pol Pot. That was the reaction to that intervention. The second major case in the modern period is the Indian invasion of East Pakistan, what's now Bangladesh, in, 1971, I guess. That also stopped a huge massacre. How did the U.S. respond to that? Well, they practically went to war with India. Seventh Fleet was sent into the Bay of Bengal, all kind of threats, embargoes, this and that. Total fury. At that point, the reason for the fury apparently was primarily that Kissinger was furious because he was planning a secret trip to China through Pakistan. And I think he seemed to be concerned that he was going to lose some good photo ops because of this. Those are the two major interventions of the modern period that have had humanitarian consequences, and the reaction of the enlightened states to them, self-declared, it's not my term, is instructive. In fact, the historical record is quite instructive. I really urge people to have a look at it. I have a book that just came out that runs through a lot of this stuff, but scratches the surface again. Take a careful look.
I thought the note you finished on was somewhat enlightening and somewhat inspiring, but a little almost naive in that we have such a grasp on what the U.S. government does that we can actually do something to change foreign policy. I mean, people have tried before, and for instance, dissidents like those at Ludlow, it didn't work out so well for them.
Oh, I don't agree. The country's changed a lot, and it's gotten a lot better. I mean, there are all kind of horrible things in U.S. history which don't happen anymore, and in the history of other countries too. They didn't. I mean, like there used to be slavery, for example. Is there slavery? What was done to the indigenous population is horrendous. But up until pretty recently, it wasn't even acknowledged. As recently as 20 or 30 years ago, it wasn't even acknowledged. Now at least it's acknowledged. Okay, that's an improvement. In the John F. Kennedy, back 1961, was perfectly capable of sending the U.S. Air Force to bomb another country. Authorized napalm, started driving the rural population into concentration camps called Strategic Hamlet, set off an ethnic cleansing program that ended up with about 10 million refugees. There wasn't a peep of protest. Go back and take a look. When the war against South Vietnam, which is what it was, began in 1961-62, there was no protest whatsoever. I mean, if the U.S. wants to send the Air Force to bomb some other country and to smash it, kill who knows how many people, who cares? You can't do that now. I mean, now it's extremely hard for the government to use violence, and they recognize it. Those are changes. And there are many other changes. The civil rights movement introduced huge changes. Rights of women have completely changed, and rights of working people too. I mean, it wasn't until the 1930s that there was even in the 1920s, the unions were totally smashed by violence. It wasn't until the 1930s that you got the right to organize. If you look over history, there has been constant struggle, including the one you mentioned, like the Ludlow massacre, sometimes defeats, but over time, things improve, and they improve through struggle, not gifts from God. Take just East Timor. Let me just take this last example. I mean, when all of these horrors were going on in the late 1970s, it was impossible to get a word about them. That was much worse than it is now. But you literally could not get a word. Ben Anderson's testimony, which I mentioned, he is maybe the leading Indonesia scholar in the world. It wasn't reported. I think I'm the only person who reported it. Now, it's now 20 years later, same story was replayed, and in fact, it was reported. It was even an op-ed in the New York Times by an Indonesia historian. All right, for the people of East Timor, it's not they're not exactly cheering about the difference, but the difference is nevertheless significant, and it will save thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives. That didn't just happen, It happened because at first an extremely small number of people, I can virtually name them, mostly young people who dropped out of school to work on it and so on, just kept plugging away at it. And finally got enough people in Congress interested so that they started pressuring and finally got a solidarity group going and were able to lobby and finally broke through the media barriers too. That's how things happen. Pardon? No. The least of it. Yeah.
Dr. Chomsky, I'd like to thank you for coming here, and I'd like to thank you for all your contributions that you make to ZMAG. It's a great resource. I'd think it's learn a lot of things from that website. But in your book, Deterring Democracy, you make many connections between capitalism and democracy that ultimately end up leading to human atrocities and eliminations of freedom. In light of this, what are we to do with democracy and capitalism? Are they inherently corrupt, or is there something we can do to fix the situation?
I think they're inconsistent. I mean, democracy is inconsistent with capitalism. This goes beyond the depth. I mean, I basically agree with 2 or 3 people who said this is kind of superficial. I agree. It's pretty superficial. Just happens to be contrary to everything you read and hear, but nevertheless it is superficial. If we look deeper, we get into real problems, like capitalism and democracy. In fact, let me just say something more about sovereignty and capitalism. I mentioned that the United States insists with passion on protecting its own sovereignty. Actually, you should have stopped me there, because that's not correct. In the back of my mind was to go on and say why it's not correct, and it's crucially not correct. The U.S. government insists on violations of U.S. sovereignty, insists on them, namely violations of sovereignty by what some international economists call the virtual Senate. That is, the community of international investors and multinational corporations who have veto power over government policy, which is granted to them by the U.S. demand on liberalization of capital flows. That's the biggest change in world order in the last 30 or 40 years. In the early 1970s, the United States destroyed the Bretton Woods system, which was based on controlled flow of capital controls and fixed exchange rates and so on. U.S. dismantled that. That led to the period of liberalization of financial flows, and it's well understood. I mean, it was understood by the people who designed the Bretton Woods system, and it's understood today that if you let capital flow freely, it grants veto power over government policy to investors. If they don't like some policy, like suppose some government, say ours, is carrying out what the community of investors, banks, financial institutions, big corporations, so on, what they consider irrational, meaning policies that just benefit the population and don't increase profits, like, say, healthcare or education or environmental protection or all of these irrational actions. If some government commits itself to irrational acts like that, the virtual Senate can stop it, namely just by emptying the capital out of the country. And when it's flowing at $1.5 trillion a day, that's quite a weapon. That overwhelms countries, including ours. Well, that is an attack on sovereignty, which is strongly supported by the U.S. government. And it's an attack on U.S. sovereignty. Well, it sounds like a contradiction until you ask yourself, what does the word United States refer to? Not to the population, rather to the corporate elite that runs the country. That's the United States. And it's their sovereignty that's being defended, not the sovereignty of the population. Well, that's a direct conflict between democracy and, liberalization of financial markets, a form of capitalism, and a very powerful one. So now at this point, we're getting into real issues, not superficial issues, but real ones. And they point to major contradictions between democracy and aversion of capitalism. I should say that when people talk about capitalism, it's a bit of a joke. There is no such thing. No country, no business class has ever been willing to subject itself to the free market discipline. Free markets are for others. Like the third world is the third world because they had free markets rammed down their throat. Meanwhile, the enlightened states, England, the United States, others, resorted to massive state intervention to protect private power, and still do. That's right up to the present. I mean, the Reagan administration, for example, was the most protectionist in post-war American history. Virtually the entire dynamic economy in the United States is based crucially on state initiative and intervention. Computers, the internet, telecommunications, automation, pharmaceuticals, you just name it, run through it, and you find massive rip-offs of the public, meaning a system in which, under one guise or another, the public pays the costs and takes the risks, and profit is privatized. That's very remote from a free market. A free market is like what India had to suffer for a couple of hundred years, or most of the rest of the third world. That's free market, and that's why they look like what they did. When we get into these issues, we're getting below the surface. But those, I'm glad you brought them up, because those are the crucial issues. Sure.
We'll do one more question.
Okay.
Maybe-
Thanks for taking my
Okay.
question.
It's interesting. Last time I was here was around 15 years ago or so.
Yeah.
At that point, nobody was worried about my energy level. I think I must be aging or something. Go ahead.
Okay, I will continue. I will continue with my question. Okay, what's your opinion about the tension between mainland China?
Sorry.
What is your opinion about the tension between mainland China and Taiwan? China very much considers it a sovereignty issue, and if China were to take military actions against Taiwan, how do you think the U.S. would react? Thank you.
How would the U.S. react if China took military action against Taiwan? I suspect it could be a nuclear war. I don't think China will do it. It's much too dangerous. I mean, at least I hope they won't. Because if they do, it's totally unpredictable. I mean, that's the kind of issue that could set off a nuclear war. In fact, the U.S. relation to China has been very tricky for years. The U.S. has recognized early on that China is in the long term going to be a major force in international affairs in Asia. And the question is how to relate to this. And if you look back at post-war history, since Second World War, the concern to find a way of balancing Chinese power in Asia, American power on the one hand, Chinese on the other, that's been a dominant theme. You might ask a question, what's American power got to do with Asia? But the U.S., remember, is supposed to run the world. And China is not an easy kind of, domino to push around. So this is a tense issue. But I frankly do not expect that China is likely to take military action. There'll be some sort of accommodation, I assume, as there has been.
My question may fall in line with that last one in an oblique sort of way. I'm wondering what you have gleaned or what you might suggest to us about the accidental U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. I find myself quite stumped about that one. Cynical, but stumped, and hoping it's true. It was just an accident. We had the wrong military map, but what do you think?
The Chinese certainly took it to be very serious.
Yes.
In fact, about the only place you could read that in the United States, their reaction, as far as I know, was in an advertising insert in the Washington Post. They took out a big insert, like 10 pages or so, which were English translations from the Chinese press, which were pretty angry, bombing the embassy, killing three journalists, and they took it to be a deliberate act. Frankly, I just find that extremely hard to believe.
So do I.
I mean, I can't imagine why the United States would have bombed the Chinese embassy. That's crazy. My suspicion is it's just plain ordinary incompetence. The incompetence, and you shouldn't be surprised at that, the incompetence of intelligence agencies is legendary. Every one of which you have records at all, whether it's the CIA or the Israeli Mossad or British, what are they, M6 or whatever they're called. They're just error after error. Usually because of extreme ideological controls. In fact, their errors are not unlike those of political analysts in the civilian sector, which is not surprising because they come from the same background and they're under the same ideological controls. Some of them are almost unimaginable. Let me just give you a couple of examples which indicate to me that they're perfectly capable of bombing the wrong place on an old map. Just take Vietnam. That was the top issue in American international affairs for 30 years. And we have a record of intelligence, a very unusual record of intelligence, because it was not released by the government, it was stolen from them. So it's like capturing enemy archives. That's the Pentagon Papers. That's 25 years, has a 25-year record of high-level intelligence, raw intelligence. CIA, DIA, whole bunch, State Department intelligence, a lot of it is in there. And it's very intriguing to look at it. In fact, that's the most interesting revelation of the Pentagon Papers, in my view, by far, is the intelligence record. Here's roughly what happened. If you're interested, I've gone through it in print in detail, but here's the main story. In the late 1940s, the United States was kind of unclear about which side to support. That was true in Indonesia. It was true in Vietnam. Do you support the colonial power that's trying to reconquer it, or do you support the indigenous government and then try to take them over? That was the question. They made different decisions in different places. In the case of Indochina, for whatever reasons, they decided at one point to support France in its reconquest of Indochina. Well, at that point, essentially orders went to the U.S. intelligence community, CIA and others, to demonstrate what was required. What was required to justify the support of France was that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were agents of either the Russians or the Chinese. Didn't really matter, one or the other. But they had to be agents of the international communist conspiracy. Okay, that would then justify support of the French reconquest. Everybody knew that was untrue, but that was plainly required for doctrinal reasons in order to support France in its reconquest. Okay, then comes a comic opera scene for about 3 years in which U.S. intelligence tries to prove what is necessary, that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh are agents of the international communist conspiracy. And they try and try. As I say, it could be either China or Russia. They didn't care. Anything would do. They couldn't do it. They couldn't find anything. They came back. Occasionally they would say, well, we think we found a copy of Pravda in the Bangkok legation or something. But finally the intelligence concluded, look, this is very weird, but this is the only place in Southeast Asia where a nationalist movement has no connections at all with China or Russia.